Our speakers today are, thank you. Our speakers today are Michael Werner, a Washington, D.C. public policy and regulatory attorney, and a co-leader of Holland & Knight's Healthcare and Life Sciences team. Michael has almost 3 decades of healthcare law, lobbying, regulatory, and reimbursement experience in Washington. He focuses on issues affecting a wide variety of FDA regulated entities, including digital healthcare technologies, which will be of special relevance today. He is also the co-founder and senior policy counsel of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, which is an excellent group. I'm very much shortening Michael's incredible resume, but that just gives you a flavor for the expertise we have on the call. We're also joined today by Sara M. Klock from Washington, D.C., a member of Holland & Knight's Public Policy and Regulation Group. Sara focuses her practice on food, drug, and device, life sciences, and political law. She advises life sciences clients on regulatory matters before authorities, including the FDA, the DEA, and the FTC. Sara is very good to know in many different contexts. So during the course of this presentation, we'll have a chat box open and you can ask questions for later. The intended format is a presentation for the first portion, and then we'll open it to questions. I'll do my best to moderate and get through as many questions as we can. In past events, we've sometimes had more questions than time, but we will do our best. So that, again, you can access the chat box at the bottom. It should be 3 dots, chat, and you can chat to all, and we'll then check questions there later. So with that, I'll turn it over to our speakers. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Michael Werner, and Sara and I, as you heard, are specialize in working with FDA-regulated entities, particularly medical device companies and particularly companies in the digital health space. And that's what really we're going to talk about today is FDA's regulatory treatment of digital health products. We're going to tag team it a little bit. So in a second, you'll hear from Sara and then myself. And what we plan to do is touch on relevant issues for you today. Brianna, I'll take the next slide. So the first thing we have to say, of course, is that this is just meant to give you kind of a high-level overview of FDA's rules. Individuals and individual companies need to seek their own legal counsel for advice about their circumstances. This is not intended to provide any of you with legal advice. Next slide. So this is what we're going to talk about today. We want to, the first part of our presentation is really designed to provide a baseline for all of you about how FDA regulates these products. So first of all, when is medical software or medical technologies, when are they considered medical devices by FDA and therefore fall under the agency's regulatory rubrics? What kinds of products are subject to regulatory oversight that requires pre-market review? FDA has a category of products in this space that they consider to be medical devices, but they are subject to so-called enforcement discretion, which we'll talk about, which is different than pre-market review. And then, of course, there's a whole lot of products like different kinds of wearables or software that are not medical devices at all. Then we're going to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and machine learning and how the FDA is trying to get its hands around that, and the new FDA Center for Digital Health Excellence. And then, as Rob said, we will have time for question and answer. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sara, who's going to start with how we think about whether software is a medical device. Sara?
Thanks, Michael. And I believe we have a few new people who have joined. Just if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll address them at the end of our presentation. Next slide, please, Brianna. So I just wanted to level set here before we get into the presentation about what types of products we are talking about that may or may not be regulated by the FDA as a medical device. And so some of these products are software products, such as PACS, which are picture archiving and communication systems and medical imaging software. But some of these are also fitness trackers or your Apple Watch or Fitbit. Some of these products are telehealth systems and remote monitoring devices and other health IT products. And so the rest of this presentation is going to be talking about products that are something like this. And there's a risk continuum and risk level based on these products. So there is a lowest risk category where FDA would not view the product as a regulated medical device to the highest risk category, which would be regulated by FDA's medical device regulations and requirements. Next slide, please. So before we get into this, we just set forth the definition of what is a medical device. So FDA is going to regulate a product based on its intended use and if the product's labeling and promotional material trigger the definition of a medical device. So what is a device? A device is an instrument, an apparatus, a machine, component, or an accessory that is ultimately intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or to cure, mitigate, or treat or prevent disease. Or it can be intended to affect the structure function of the body. And so this definition is quite broad. FDA views this definition quite broad. And Michael and I oftentimes see clients make the determination by themselves that the product is not a medical device without bringing outside counsel in to help, vet the product and vet the device. With that said, there are some products that may technically meet these definitions, but in 2016, Congress passed the 21st Century Cures Act, which explicitly excluded some types of software products from the definition of medical device. And we're going to get into that a little bit later in this presentation. So the framework is quite complicated. Both FDA and Congress are constantly reviewing these types of products. Most recently, FDA issued a proposed regulation where they would actually exclude more products, and then they withdrew that proposed regulation shortly thereafter. So there's a lot of movement in this space, and frankly, the space is fluid at best. Next slide, please. So currently, FDA views all medical device software as, or it applies FDA's current medical device framework to medical device software. So FDA's policies are not specific to the type of technology or the platform that the technology is used on, whether that be a cell phone, a Fitbit, a computer, or what have you. FDA is going to use the same rules that apply to devices. So if a software product meets the definition of a medical device, and that product could impose some safety risk or patient safety issue, if the product were not to work as intended, FDA is going to take enforcement against that product and the manufacturer and regulate that product. Next slide, please. So there are three general categories of if a software is a medical device. So the first category is going to be, and it's going to be the highest risk on that continuum that we started with, those products that meet the definition of a medical device and therefore are subject to FDA's rules and regulations. So this would include pre-market clearance through a 510K or pre-market approval if it's a class 3 device. Because these products meet the definition of a medical device and therefore pose great safety risk. So FDA generally has a bucket of requirements for medical device manufacturers and distributors. Those include establishment registration, device listing, quality systems, recall policies, anything that would typically apply to a normal everyday medical device. The second category that's applicable to medical devices are those products that may technically meet the definition of a medical device, but FDA has said they're low risk and therefore they fall under FDA's enforcement discretion. We're going to get much deeper into this. This is pretty high level. FDA has set forth a number of examples that would fall under enforcement discretion, and FDA has said that if a product is under enforcement discretion, FDA can regulate it, they can inspect, but FDA really isn't going to go after those manufacturers. They're just going to recommend that the manufacturers have appropriate quality systems in place to manufacture and distribute the device. And then the final category are those products that are not a medical device, whether because they don't meet the definition of a medical device, that's not their intended use, or FDA has excluded them, or sorry, Congress has excluded them from the 21st Century Cures Act, or FDA is reevaluating those types of products. Next slide, please. So we are going to specifically talk about general wellness products and clinical decision support software later in this presentation, but these are the buckets that have been excluded under the 21st Century Cures Act and therefore are not devices. They include administrative support, general wellness, electronic patient records, software that transfers, stores, converts, or displays, and then clinical decision support. And so if your software does one of these and only one of these, then therefore it's not a regulated medical device. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael to talk about software that's subject to FDA's pre-market review.
Thanks, Sarah. Brianna will take the next slide. So what we're now going to do is kind of drill a layer or two down from the high level discussion that Sara just engaged in and talk a little bit more specifically. Next slide. So as we've said, and as Sara mentioned, FDA will regulate some software as a medical device that requires pre-market review, and they do a risk-based analysis to make that determination. And so these are kind of three general categories of products that FDA would say, if this is your product as a manufacturer, it's a medical device, and either it needs a clearance under a 510K, or perhaps you need to do, if it's a class 3 device, you might need to do clinical trials. And so just quickly, this is software that's an extension of one or more devices for purposes of control. We'll talk about some specific examples of all of these. But the other is like a software function such as a mobile app. And then the other is a medical device because it performs patient-specific analysis and provides patient-specific diagnosis and treatment recommendations. And that is where Sara and I see many of our clients kind of get tripped up by FDA regulation. In other words, if you have a software product that just provides medical information for a patient, such as, for their general wellness, which Sarah's going to talk about, or is it a product that actually does more than that and provides specific analysis or diagnosis or a treatment recommendation? And once you have software that kind of crosses that threshold and provides that functionality, that's the red flag, for FDA, and they say that's a medical device. Next slide. So here's the first item. It's a software function that's an extension of a device and connects to it for purposes of control or analysis. And very often, by the way, software that's connected to a medical device somehow and is an extension of it, or has the function that is done by an existing medical device, typically falls within the definition of a medical device. So here's an example of a device that software that controls a medical device. So let's say you've developed a mobile app that a person with diabetes has on their phone, and when they need to control the delivery of insulin into their body, they can activate it through a mobile app on their phone, right? Well, that's an example of a software function that's an extension of a device, i.e. the insulin pump, and it controls the device. It turns it on and off. It tells it, yes, now you need to go, or no, now you need to stop. So that's an example of that kind of software function that controls a medical device. Next slide, Brianna. Okay, so then what do we mean by transforming a platform by using attachments, display screens, or sensors? Well, what about if you have a software function? These are all examples, right? You have a mobile platform for device functions, such as a blood glucose strip reader that's on a medical platform. Well, that's going to be a medical device. Just like a glucose meter is a medical device, if you've got a software function that serves that purpose, that's going to be a medical device, right? It's transforming a mobile platform into a regulated device. Next slide. And then I talked about the patient-specific diagnosis or treatment, and you're going to hear about this a little bit several times throughout our presentation. But this is the distinction between you've got a medical device that tells people, you know, what their heart rate is or how many steps they've taken in the course of a day, versus medical software that says, hey, Michael, you've taken, you know, your heart rate is really increasing rapidly. You need to, you know, have you taken your medication today? Or maybe this is a sign of X disease. That's when you start crossing that line into a medical device function, right? If you're talking about diagnosis and treatment recommendations from the software, as opposed to just providing information that might help a person with their, you know, kind of manage their healthcare or manage their well-being. Next slide. Okay, so then Sara mentioned that there are some devices that FDA applies enforcement discretion. So what that really means is that FDA thinks the software falls within the definition of a medical device. But because the risk is low, and again, when they say risk, what they mean is the risk to the user if the software does not function as intended, right? So if you think about a medical device that might be high risk, right? Let's think of a pacemaker, right? If it doesn't function as intended, that's a serious health risk to a patient. But there might be some software that if it doesn't work as intended, it's not a good thing, but it might not mean that the patient's health is immediately at risk. And in those cases, FDA will apply enforcement discretion, which basically means we as the regulatory agency believe that our regulations apply to your product, and we have the right to enforce those regulations. So Sara mentioned this at the beginning. We have the right to, for example, inspect your facility. We have the right to make sure that you've got recall procedures in place. We have the right to make sure you've got a quality system in place. Whether or not FDA ever exercises those rights is a separate question, but it's very clear that they have those rights, And therefore, what we always advise clients is you need to make sure you've got processes in place. First of all, you probably want to do it because it's good corporate behavior and good business behavior for your technology, right? You want to make sure that you've got quality systems. You want to make sure that if something goes wrong, you have the ability to fix it and notify your customers and all of that. But also because if in fact FDA knocks on your door, they're going to want to see it. And FDA has made it very clear that even though you don't need pre-market review and pre-market approval or clearance, we're going to want to see that kind of process in place if we come and look at your company and look at your product. So what are some examples of that? Next slide. These are typically products that say might show medical trends. Again, not providing the specific treatment or treatment suggestions. Those products probably require pre-market review, but it might be that it might be something that shows a trend, like here's my monthly heart rate, right? Over, not just here it is today, but here it is over the last month, shows a trend. It's a medical device, probably, but probably doesn't require pre-market review. It would require a pre-market review if it said, hey, and because of this, you need to do this, right? You need to go, take this medicine or what have you. These are all very, very fact-specific scenarios. And we're just giving you some very general rules. But you can see that sometimes the distinctions are very subtle that FDA makes. So it really is important to pay close attention to these rules and be very specific about the functionality of your software. And this is another example we give on this slide, a software function that helps you communicate with your doctors, like maybe it captures an image for you about a condition, right? Like you want to show your doctor a picture of the rash on your leg, that maybe it came from the medicine that he or she prescribed. Things like that, those are considered devices by FDA, but likely don't require pre-market review. Next slide. So as I mentioned, if you have software that's under FDA's enforcement discretion, FDA has made it very clear publicly that they recommend that you implement quality system programs to ensure your products meet requirements and specs, and that you can support the software through its life cycle. So things like appropriate labeling, appropriate good manufacturing practices, the ability to initiate prompt corrections to your software, handle complaints, all of those things. Again, if it's a device that does not need pre-market review, you don't have to do all that before you put your product on the market, but it is highly recommended that you have those systems in place, because if you do, first of all, when FDA comes, you'll be able to show them and they won't take enforcement action against you. And second of all, it will almost for sure be good mitigation of other kinds of liability risks. Because if something does happen and someone gets hurt and there's, for example, litigation subsequently, if it turns out your product was a regulated medical device and you are required by or recommended by FDA to take these actions and you didn't, that's probably a bad fact for you in the context of a negotiation during litigation. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Sara, who's going to talk a little bit about software that's not a medical device, including clinical decision software.
Thanks, Michael. Next slide, please, Brianna. So we have listed here a number of software products that are not considered a medical device, but I just want to pause for a second and say that this is policy, this is not law. And so what is not considered a medical device today may be considered a medical device tomorrow, although the trend has been that FDA has actually declassified more software products to fall into the bucket of enforcement discretion or not a medical device, rather than up-classify, so say they are a medical device when they weren't previously. However, this is incredibly fluid. The agency is trying to get up to speed, right? The technology is moving faster than the agency is. And Michael will speak to that a little bit later about AI and machine learning, but we expect the agency to continue enforcing these areas and potentially an uptick based on the flood that has occurred over the last few years. Separately, the list that I have included here is not exhaustive, but has changed over time. So this list is based on an FDA guidance document, which was initially published in 2013, was updated in 2019. And so there is a likelihood, within the next few years that FDA will update it to include more products. But generally, software that is used in a healthcare environment, clinical care, patient management, used by doctors, right? These are products that the list here are products that FDA does not view as a medical device, either because they're low risk, either because they don't meet the definition of medical device. But some of these are products that you would see in a different form, right? So if it's patient education material, if typically you go in to get a physical, there are pamphlets on the wall that you can take home with you. So something like that, FDA is going to treat the same way as a physical document, or they're copies of what's out there. Most notably, software that functions like an electronic health record software that is also certified by the ONC Health IT certification program would not be regulated as a medical device. With that said, Michael and I are aware of products on the market that touch software, that touch electronic health record software that may be considered a medical device. And so again, this is super product specific. And with the EHR software exclusion, that's not a device here, FDA also requires the software to be certified under the ONC Health IT certification program. To our knowledge, all of the major electronic health record systems have this certification. And then administrative support tools, right? How software helps doctors get through their days easier is also likely not going to be considered a medical device. Next slide, please. So I'm next going to talk about general wellness products. Next slide, please. Like the previous guidance document, this guidance document has also been updated recently, last few years or so. And there is a likelihood that a product could be both a general wellness product and a regulated medical device if it has multiple functions. So for example, the Apple Watch is generally a general wellness product and therefore not a regulated medical device. However, the Apple Watch has specific functions, such as their ECG abilities, that are regulated medical devices that require pre-market review. So this is function and product super specific, but generally a general wellness product has two categories, and these products are only used for general wellness. So the first category are those products that are intended, its intended use relates to maintaining or encouraging a general state of health or healthy activity. These types of products do not make claims or references to disease or conditions. They make claims to help promote or maintain a healthy weight, encourage healthy eating, or assist with weight loss goals. Their claims to promote relaxation or manage stress. A claim that the product will treat or diagnose obesity would not be a general wellness product. A product that claims to treat an eating disorder, such as anorexia, would not be regulated as a general wellness product. FDA is very strict on this. We see a bunch of products on the market being marketed as a general wellness product that if the manufacturer or my client, I would advise them that they aren't actually. So we see a lot of products get hung up in this bucket. The second category of general wellness products are those products that are intended for a healthy lifestyle, and how do these products help reduce the risk or impact of certain diseases? So unlike the first category, the second category actually makes reference to a disease state. However, to fall under the second category of a general wellness product and therefore not be a regulated medical device, the product must be intended to promote, track, or encourage choices which are a part of a healthy lifestyle, and they may help reduce the risk of certain chronic diseases. Not they will, it's definitely a may. And then the second subcategory is that these products may help with living with the disease. So both may help reduce the risks and then may help with living with these diseases. So both of these subcategories should only be based on reference where the disease is well understood and how a healthy lifestyle could help reduce those diseases. So an example of this type of product would be that a product coaches a breathing technique or relaxation skills, which as part of a healthy lifestyle may, help alleviate headaches. So this is product specific, this is claim specific, but assuming you fall into one of the buckets of a general wellness product, then FDA isn't going to regulate you as a medical device. Also, FDA wants manufacturers who think they operate in this space to say, is the product invasive? If the product is invasive, it is not a general wellness product. Is the product implanted? If the product is implanted in your body, it is not a general wellness product. And lastly, is there a safety risk, right? This is what we've been talking about throughout this entire presentation, is that safety and software are incredibly important to FDA and FDA's classifications of these products. And so if there is a safety risk, if the regulatory controls are not applied, then FDA would not regulate this product as a general wellness product and would be regulated as a medical device. Next slide, please. So an exclusion like general wellness products from the definition of a medical device under the 21st Century Cures Act is clinical decision support software. Next slide, please. So clinical decision support software is used by physicians regularly. We regularly encounter clients who have told us that their clinical decision support software is not a medical device without an analysis undertaken. The rules surrounding clinical decision support software are both very strict and under consideration by the FDA. So on its face, for a product to meet the definition of a clinical decision support software and therefore not be regulated by the FDA as a medical device, the software must be only used by a healthcare provider, not by a patient, not by a patient caregiver, only by a healthcare provider. And that software is not intended to acquire, process, or analyze a medical image or signal from an in vitro diagnostic device. The software is not intended for the software is intended for the purpose of displaying, analyzing, printing medical information. The software is intended for the purpose of supporting or providing recommendations to a healthcare professional about the prevention or diagnosis or treatment of the condition. And the software is intended for the healthcare professional to review the basis of this software. So while this is set forth in the 21st Century Cures Act, what is not set forth is what this actually means outside of this strict definition. So we have clients who have software that may technically meet the definition of clinical decision support software, but there's some ambiguity about how that healthcare professional independently evaluates that recommendation. Lately, we've been seeing a lot of potential clinical decision support software be also in the AI context, right? So Michael's going to speak to AI a little bit more shortly, but AI recommends recommends to a physician a patient diagnosis or something like that. And so how then does the healthcare provider verify the AI's recommendation? Next slide, please. So FDA has issued draft guidance on clinical decision support software. It's not even final guidance. It's been amended once. It's likely going to be amended again, but FDA breaks clinical decision support software into non-device clinical decision support software. So therefore it wouldn't meet the definition of a medical device because it meets all of the 4 criteria that we just laid out. Or it's device clinical decision support software, which FDA is going to use the entire framework we've been talking about this entire time. So does it meet the definition of medical device? Yes. What is the risk profile, right? Could it fall under enforcement discretion or is it low risk? And then could a patient or a caregiver use this product if it's not a healthcare provider? Clinical decision support software, while it appears easy to classify a product on its face, whether it is or is not, is a little bit more nuanced than I think it initially appears, especially to a lot of healthcare providers. We've had a handful of clients call us up and ask for additional guidance on this specifically, and we expect this only to flood the market even more because there's no final guidance on this. With that, I will turn it over to Michael to talk about AI and machine learning.
Thanks, Sarah. Next slide, Brianna. So really what I wanted to say about AI, there's a couple of takeaway messages. The first thing is that we of course could have entire webinars just about AI, and so we really just wanted to touch on it here. And there's a couple of takeaways. One is that the distinction between medical software and medical software that has AI is starting, based on the clients that come to us, the companies that come to us, is starting to blur. So on the one hand, AI is a particular category of technology, but on the other, it's really just in many ways kind of just the next step in a lot of these software the software that's been developed. And so the two takeaways are, number one, FDA is pretty much going to treat products with AI and that have machine learning the way we're talking about products now, which is to say they could be medical devices if they fall within the definition of a medical device and perform the functions like we talked about earlier in this presentation, right? If you have a product that uses AI to help a patient, help a user make a treatment decision, or helps diagnose a disease or condition, well, that's going to be a medical device. Whether we talked about it as AI or not, you really, in this field, what we have found is that it's very fact specific, and really what matters is what's the intended use of the software. That's how FDA makes a regulatory determination. What does it do? How does it work? And what's its intended use? So that's the first sort of takeaway around AI. The second is that the FDA is scrambling to try to get its hands around all of these technologies because they know that they're exploding, and they are trying to understand them and make sure that their regulatory framework can encompass them appropriately. So they are right now developing what they call, I'm going to talk about this in a second, an AR/ML framework. They are talking about what would be good machine learning practices for manufacturers that they want to encourage. FDA has made it very clear that they want to promote innovation in this space. They want to have, therefore, a streamlined and hopefully simple regulatory framework. But of course, they know that there could be risks to the user, risks to the patient, so they want to make sure that there's appropriate protections. Next slide. So just a few months ago, they issued what they referred to as an action plan on AI and machine learning. And basically, I have it listed here. I won't go through all of it, but these are the things that FDA has announced it's going to do. I would just point to a couple of things like developing methods to evaluate and improve machine learning algorithms, and that they're going to issue more guidance in the future around what are the elements needed to support safety and efficacy of software as a medical device algorithms, and on labeling, i.e. what you can say about your software and what it can do, and how we can be as transparent as possible about that software and how it's regulated. Next slide. And part of that, next, comes from this new Center for Digital Health Excellence, which was launched in 2020. So this center is where perhaps it's the opposite, which is the action plan I described was launched by this center, which came about in September of 2020. And you can see it's really about trying to think about new ways to develop innovative regulatory approaches. What I want you to remember from this is two things. One, that it demonstrates what I just said, which is that there is a strong commitment from FDA to support the development and use of digital health technologies. So for any of you that are interested in this space, that's actually a really good scenario. It doesn't mean that you're going to agree with the way FDA treats your product or what have you. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that FDA is committed to these technologies, which is going to pay dividends because they're going to be consistently trying to streamline their processes, consistently trying to make their processes and regulations consistent with technological advances. And all of that is for the benefit. It's certainly going to be better for users, and it's going to be better for developers. The other thing to know is this center is not responsible for marketing authorization. So if you have a product that does need a 510K for clearance, this center is not the place where you're going to go. It's the Center for Devices, just like every other medical device, is the entity within FDA that's going to review your product. Next slide. So I just mentioned that this is just the purpose and activities of the action plan and the Center of Excellence. They're gonna, kind of lead. So by the fact that it's leading the Center for Devices shows you that the agency is committed to making sure that they understand the latest science and the latest technology in a way that will be helpful for product developers and sponsors. Next slide. So finally, just some takeaway messages that we want to leave with you before we turn to Q&A. FDA regulates these products, medical software, digital health, like medical devices, unless they fall outside very clearly I don't want to say that there's not nuance, but there are very definitive categories of products that are not devices, but otherwise they are. The extent of the regulation depends on the product, its features, its intended use, and the risk to the patient if it doesn't work as intended. It's a fact-specific analysis. And one thing is for sure, we know that this is a fluid area, and regulations and enforcement activity by the agency are going to continue, and they're going to continue to evolve as technology develops. And with that, I'll turn it back to Rob. We have some time for questions about perhaps what we didn't cover, or perhaps what we did cover that you have questions about.
Well, first off, thank you very much, Michael and Sarah. That's, I think, a great overview, and it shows how there's so many interesting gray zone questions throughout this in some circumstances, and how much of a moving target there is as well. So I'm just going to turn to the chat for a moment. Question from Philip: if we can email this presentation. Yes, we'll be able to do that. Then Lamont has asked a question that's very interesting. He's talking about how there seems to be a distinction between unsophisticated, for example, patients versus sophisticated, for example, nurse information consumers. And he's talking about, what about software that, for example, gathers sensor data from various manufacturers to, say, alert nurses to check on a patient or something like that? Would they share responsibility with the monitor device itself, or are they only a helper? And I think Lamont in this question is trying to get at, is this clinical decision support software something else? He thinks it sounds like a great area. So what about things that are directed in this kind of, not directly to a consumer, but still providing certain kinds of functionality?
So I'll say, Lamont, I actually have two questions from your questions that I don't need an answer to. But the first thing, right, is a product won't meet the definition of clinical decision support software if it's used by someone other than a healthcare provider. And then secondly, part of the four-prong test separate from the healthcare provider part is if the software acquires signal acquisition system data. So if the software you're talking about is acquiring the data from a signal acquisition data, I know in the presentation I had only said from an in vitro diagnostic. The definition is a little bit more than that. So my apologies for not being clear there, but I would say yes, it's gray based on my knowledge. If not, definitely doesn't meet the definition of clinical decision support software. With that said, that doesn't mean there isn't another bucket that this type of product could fit under. It could be still a product under enforcement discretion that doesn't need pre-market review or pre-market clearance.
Yeah, and I agree with Sarah that, and the only thing I would add is that typically, when FDA talks about healthcare providers, they're not just talking about physicians. So I only say that because Lamont's question referred to a nurse specifically. And so to Sarah's point, clinical decision software is used by healthcare professionals, but that it doesn't have to just be physicians. It could be a nurse as well.
Well, I'll ask if anyone has any additional questions, please add them to the chat. One thing that I think would be helpful to talk about for a moment too is FDA regulation onerous, and what are the risks to non-compliance?
So maybe I'll start and Sarah will chime in. Well, of course, a word like onerous is in the eye of the beholder, right? So, but we'll say this: most medical software, if it needs pre-market clearance, it's typically a 510(k) process, typically, which I don't want to suggest is necessarily simple, but it does requires a little research. But that's a process that typically does not involve doing, for example, independent clinical trials or any of those kinds of things. So usually 510K process, let's just say pre-pandemic, FDA would say a 510K process would take under a year, depending on the product. Now, if you're talking about, and of course, a product that isn't regulated at all is on the other end of that spectrum. In the middle, you have these products that are under enforcement discretion. And so in our view, we would say clients, we have this conversation with clients a lot, and because we say, you don't have to be, let's use the word, overwhelmed by the fact that FDA calls it a medical device, because you don't need to go through any kind of pre-market clearance process, pre-market approval process. So you can bring your product to the market. You do have to have these good processes in place, but I would venture to say, and it's our experience, that the companies that are reputable companies developing a product they stand behind tend to have these processes in place to begin with. And so there might be some tweaking we want to do or some additions we want to make to these processes, but it's generally, most of the clients we have don't find it super onerous. And there certainly can be adjusted for the company. And by that, I mean, if you're a big medical software company, right? If you're, Siemens or IBM or something like that, that's kind of one thing. If you're a smaller company that has one software product and you have 10 employees, and you're going to want to have those similar processes, but they'll be for your company. So nobody's going to expect that you have a whole team of regulatory folks like a big company would have. So they're not meant to be too onerous. And the risk of noncompliance is that certainly if FDA does inspect, or if a problem occurs, then you could end up you're certainly in a better situation if you've done your work on the front end. FDA won't find you out of compliance. They won't subject you to any sanctions or penalties. And then of course your risk and civil liability is less as well. Sara, anything I missed or you want to add?
No, I think that was great.
So we have another great question. When speaking to your biotech medtech customers, what is the biggest challenge your clients face when trying to launch an SAMD?
So for everyone's edification, SMAD would be software as a medical device. I would say we spend the majority of our time trying to appropriately classify and design the product to follow what the client wants. And so we have clients that are those type of tech clients that are not medical device manufacturers at all. And they don't want the product to be a medical device. And so it's a long back and forth about the features of the product, what the product can and cannot do to, I wouldn't say avoid. They're not trying to actively, not be regulated by the FDA, but to design the technology appropriately to fall within either a bucket of enforcement discretion or a bucket of a product that's not a medical device. Some of our tech clients are on the market currently, and it's a vetting of what they currently have to ensure they're not violating FDA's laws. Sometimes it's a really easy fix, so you can just stop having a product feature. Or we see this a lot in the clinical decision support context, and the AI clinical decision support is providing a link to that recommendation on the doctor's computer, verifying where the information came from, which is why I mentioned it, because we have advised clients to say, actually, if this is where the physician is receiving that information, just include it with the recommendation. Michael?
Yeah, I mean, all I was going to add to that was, look, I mean, you may say to me that the biggest challenge for a med tech or a biotech company is raising capital and all of those kinds of things. And we're obviously not talking about that here. I agree with what Sara said, and that from where we are, and perhaps because it's what the advice clients ask us for, is it's really best to, as early as possible, think about the regulatory bucket that your product can fall into. We work with companies and we work with their software designers, and we talk to them about what are the features of this software you're trying to enable. What do you want users to be able to do? And now let's talk about, okay, so if that's true, how can we do this in a way that's going to be, again, not avoid, but kind of the regulatory classification that's most appropriate, and hopefully for the company, sort of the least onerous. And it's certainly, I would say, in some ways, the biggest challenge they face is that they've already designed it, they're about to launch, they've signed an agreement with suppliers or with customers, then they come to us and we say, well, gee, if you want to do that and you want to make those marketing claims, that's going to require pre-market review, and now we have to kind of figure out a workaround or something. So to me, the biggest challenge is have the conversation with whoever, right? I mean, we do it, but whoever you're working with early enough so that you can design your product and think about its intended use in the way that makes the most sense from a regulatory perspective. Rob, we can't hear you.
Locally muted. Thank you both very much. We're, I think, at the end of our time, but thank you for the great presentation. Thank you to our, we have time for one last question, just under the wire. Some software data collection may be collected for the purpose of the clinician, but patients may view it and then use it to independently make adjustments. Patients use it outside intended use. Does that change its classification?
So that makes me think of like if the patient has access to their electronic health record, right? So if the physician has included it in their EHR, I'm not actually concerned about it. If the patient is in the room with the physician, I think it's questionable, right? This is fluid. And it really depends on how the patient's getting that information, and less so what they're doing with it.
Yeah, I agree. And don't forget, if a doctor is examining you and says, here, look at your blood pressure, right? Has the blood pressure cuff and all that, and says to you, look at your blood pressure. That's a medical device. If he or she is using digital technology and your blood pressure comes up on the screen, right? I mean, FDA is going to say, if it's a blood pressure device and it's just substituting for what is already a physical medical device, that's a device. So.
Well, excellent. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks to the excellent questions we had and the participants. And hope to see everyone at future events in the Harvard Healthcare Trends series. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.